I'm Danielle Gauthier, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Threat Intelligence at Dragos. Welcome to our OT Cybersecurity Year in Review Vulnerability Briefing. Today, we're going to be providing some updates on what's changed since last year. We're going to be looking at the top vulnerability trends and highlighting critical vulnerabilities with guidance demonstrating Dragos' unique approach to managing them. We have a lot to cover today, and we're very pleased that you could join us. But before we get started, this session is being recorded and the recording will be emailed to everyone after the session. Also, your microphones have been muted, but we still want to interact with you. Please use the Q&A chat feature to submit any questions you have, and we'll try to get to your questions at the end. And now I'd like to introduce the speakers of today's session, two vulnerability analysts from the Dragos intelligence team. We have Logan Carpenter and Nick Cano. And with that, let's get started. Logan, can you kick it off?
Yes, thanks, Danielle. Hello, everyone. My name is Logan Carpenter. I'm a vulnerability analyst here at Dragos. I've been here for about 2.5 years, and I get to work with a lot of awesome vulnerability analysts and malware analysts as well. And today, Nick and I will be jumping into some very interesting topics. And I'll let Nick take it over, and I'll see you guys later.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Cano. I'm a vulnerability analyst here at Dragos. I've been with the company close to 3 years, and I'm really excited today to be showing you these slides with you. So let's get started. Next slide, please. Obtaining new vulnerability data. We normally get asked how or where we get our sources from, so we made sure to have multiple sources to obtaining data for our vulnerability coverage, which is why we categorize them into 3 groups. Our first one being our main source. Main sources are obtained through advisories that get published by either vendors, public vulnerability disclosure programs, Dragos Research being us, and the government organizations such as CISA. Our second sources are independent or individual researchers that publish their vulnerabilities in their own research page, social medias, and vulnerability-related databases and websites. Research teams or companies discover these vulnerabilities are typically posting them in their own vulnerability pages, along with publishing detailed blogs and of their findings, which we do use and acknowledge. On some occasions, we do find public POCs in research and exploit database websites, which do not have ties to CVEs or advisories. We've noticed CISA does find some of these and does report them to their own page themselves, which then we do track ourselves. Finally, our third source is OT Cert. This is where researchers reach out to us regarding vulnerabilities they've discovered within OT products. And since we're CNA, we get to go through with them and then analyze and then decide if this is something that needs a CVE to be given. We wanted a way to track all these specific sources and data since it's a lot to track, so we created Elmer. Elmer is our in-house scraper that notifies us of any new vendor advisory or publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. It scrapes directly from sources we want and not just every single CVE that gets published through cve.org, NIST, and such sources, so we can have a more manual overview of vulnerabilities and industries we focus on. Next slide, please. Vulnerability analysis process. We like to keep it simple and actionable so we can make the teams easier when it comes to looking at their advisories, specifically because there is a lot of advisories with a lot of pages on them. Which is why our format is simplified to what is it, why does it matter, and what can we do about it. What also makes our vulnerability analysis process special is the manual process, which our research team likes to call the Drago sauce. We go over multiple advisories linked to vulnerabilities to ensure that we have as much detail as possible from different sources, including alternatives to patching, which might not be available or in some cases not possible due to the structure of the environment. The alternative mitigations we provide can include port numbers, services, details, configurations, file extensions, entry points of exploitation, and such, which may have not been included in the original advisory. We've also encountered a decent amount of research team blogs that do not include specific details, such as the protocols and services that we do add later into our own advisories. Some of the ways we get these missing details is by downloading software, pulling down files, and going over documentation. Having the correct CVSS scores and other key details could help us improve prioritizing vulnerabilities, which is why we correct the scores if it requires it to reflect the vulnerability better. We also get to have a better decision or overview of the vulnerability if it could cause a disruption to the OT environment by manually analyzing these vulnerabilities. This information also helps us determine how fast the vulnerability should be addressed within the now, next, never system, which I'll be addressing later on in the slides. Next slide, please. In 2023, we covered 2010 CVEs with a total of 531 advisories. Out of 531 advisories, 31% of the CVSS scores needed a correction, and 49% of advisories had Dragos include missing mitigations, which included protocol numbers and such that we brought up in the past slides. Out of 2010 CVEs analyzed, 9% were more severe than the CVSS score given, 4% were found to be less severe, and 1% were the same. Next slide, please. The rise of authentication-required vulnerabilities. In 2023, we did notice an increase in vulnerabilities requiring authentication for exploitation. We believe the potential reason for this could be for more vendors, that more vendors are implementing authentication, and the low-hanging no authentication bugs have been mostly discovered. This is forcing researchers to move towards vulnerabilities that require authentication. Although devices with authentication is a good thing, it doesn't make it fully secure, as adversaries could access through many ways, such as default credentials, backdoors, brute force attacks, credential theft, and so on. Next slide, please. I will be passing this over to Logan.
So, hello everyone again. As we continue our exploration of OT's vulnerability landscape, we want to turn our focus to some of the events of 2023. And 2023 was a pivotal year for OT security. It was marked by lots of significant breaches, innovative attacks, important lessons learned. And in this section, we'll deep dive into these events and understanding their impacts, lessons, and other interesting tidbits. And we'll start by talking about this Rockwell control logics, these Rockwell control logics vulnerabilities. So the United States government basically informed Rockwell Automation that there may be attack tools out in the wild related to a set of vulnerabilities discovered in some PLC communication modules. And Rockwell swiftly began studying the impact of these vulnerabilities. And even, legend has it, they brought in retired employees. They brought employees out of retirement to address these issues in some legacy devices. And recognizing the critical nature of these threats, they set out to ensure that their customers not only were equipped with the latest firmware updates, but also had advanced network detections in place ready, just in case any kind of use it or lose it situation might happen with the malware authors. Now, this is where the story takes an interesting turn. In an unprecedented move, Rockwell Automation brought together an alliance of private sector vendors, many of whom usually would consider each other competitors. And what was the goal of this? Basically to collectively develop, test, and deploy detections before the vulnerabilities were disclosed publicly. This was a huge risk for Rockwell Automation, in part because, what if one of the vendors decides to leak it to be first? Or, what if the malware authors get tipped off that, this thing kind of has went around to different security vendors? But all parties involved decided to pinky promise and play by the rules, and Rockwell Automation brought everyone together in like this open channel of communication, and Dragos was actually one of those vendors. So once we were briefed on the matter, of course, our vulnerability team and our malware team, started pulling firmware and trying to figure out what the vulnerabilities that were being exploited were, and trying to see if we could recreate them, because, not all the information was shared, but what was shared was some of the detections that were created beforehand that Rockwell Automation shared with us and the rest of the vendors as well. And Dragos was able to have an immediate impact due to the infrastructure we've developed over the years. By harnessing our capabilities of OT Watch and Neighborhood Keeper, Dragos was able to set itself apart by demonstrating our capacity to get real-time feedback straight from live operational environments. And this proactive approach led to a very important discovery. And that discovery was that the initial detections that were given to us generated way too many false positives, and they needed to be tuned. And this feedback loop was critical, because had these detections gone live and we not had, OT Watch and Keeper to test them in, asset owners would have had no choice but to ignore them just from the sheer number of alerts they were generating. And the key takeaways from this are not just the vulnerabilities. Actually, I want you to put the vulnerabilities aside for now. The fact that, once again, we've been able to outmaneuver an adversary for the second year straight, I may add, because if you remember, in the previous year, that's when the pipe dream malware was actually released. So this was the second year in a row we've been able to outmaneuver the adversary. But what I really, really want you to take away is that this is a remarkable story of industry-wide collaboration. For Dragos, there was kind of this profound sense of accomplishment, knowing that our infrastructure is primed to swiftly deploy analytics and detections in live OT environments if this type of situation ever comes up again. And on a personal level, like on a personal note, I witnessed some of the most awesome collaboration among vendors who prioritize the mission above all else. And you guys can be rest assured that your OT security is in capable hands, because when it comes to these critical events like this, brand labels on the sensors become irrelevant. And what truly matters is the collective priority of safeguarding civilization. And so kudos to our competitors for putting our differences aside and doing it for the benefit of the public. And I want to give a special shout out to Maggie Morganti from Rockwell Automation. She deserves special acknowledgement because she is the one who made the decision to take the risk of bringing in these outside organizations to address a very significant and albeit sensitive problem. So that's true leadership, and it's great to know that there are people like that within our community. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the threat group Cyber Avengers, but basically what had happened is, in response to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a group calling themselves the Cyber Avengers launched a campaign targeting equipment manufactured in Israel. Now, this was a worldwide initiative. It resulted in multiple incidents, including a water utility that was taken offline for 2 days. A separate incident involved breaching a water authority in Pennsylvania. And this actually was targeting a Unitronics PLC. And Dragos actually was able to get our hands on one of the compromised PLCs to thoroughly understand, the vulnerabilities of Cyber Avengers exploited, and whether or not the guidance that was put out into the world, was actually, useful. And several factors contributed to the compromise of these PLCs that we have received. Primarily, the equipment was connected to the internet, making it very easy to target. The attackers used the device's native PCOM protocol to upload empty ladder logic programs, and this basically effectively wiped the existing logic on the controllers, and this disrupted operations. Additionally, they renamed the device's internal name to #Gaza. And this basically kept the management software, the PLC management software, from being able to connect to the PLC. And this prevented remote restoration attempts and basically required decommissioning the PLC. Now, our follow-on analysis, when we started diving deeper and looking for other vulnerabilities, it revealed that the guidance that was given, which was basically change the default password, would actually not protect asset owners. And this is due to the fact that the device lacked adequate password protection mechanisms. So basically, you can use the PCOM protocol to ask for the password from the device. But I should mention that this technique, although it can be used, there is no evidence that it has been used in a while. We've recently released a report on these particular vulnerabilities. So at the moment, we don't have any intel suggesting that the Cyber Avengers are actually using this technique, but albeit it is an issue. And basically what this is a screenshot from the PLC management software. And what this was taken by one of our analysts, Reed Whiteman. And this is showing that the issue, like from them changing that PLC's name on the device using this protocol, the software, you need that name in order to connect to it. So it was impossible to talk to it. So next slide, please. So the attack methods used by the cyber avengers were very simple, but they were remarkably effective, and this kind of aligns with their strategy of like going after the lowest hanging fruit. um, and that simplicity that I'm talking about is, okay, we uploaded blank ladder logic, that's very simple, and then what do? We make it impossible for them to talk to the PLC because there's this one little bug that if you change the name and they don't know it, then they can't connect to it. So that's super simple, but it was very effective. It took down operations, and unfortunately, our intelligence indicates that there are our intelligence indicates that there are tons of these devices that are unpatched, still connected to the internet, and it's leaving them susceptible to future attacks. And given that this threat group is still very active, and the ineffectiveness of the initial remediation advice, if they decide to go back and find those vulnerabilities that Dragos found, new campaigns against these systems are likely. So the next event I wanted to talk about is related to VOLTZITE, more specifically the Ivanti 0 days. And basically, a security firm known as VOLTZITE reported that in late 2023, VOLTZITE, also known as Volt Typhoon, conducted targeted campaigns against Ivanti Connect Secure VPNs. And basically, this is a widely used remote access solution. And during this campaign, they exploited a pair of zero-day vulnerabilities that allowed the adversary to steal configuration data, alter existing files, retrieve files from remote locations, and establish a bunch of reverse tunnels from the Ivanti VPN appliances. The vulnerabilities allow VOLTZITE to bypass authentication and leverage command injection. So basically, there's two vulnerabilities. One was one allowed them to bypass authentication, and then the other was various command injection vulnerabilities throughout the system's web servers. And this enabled the adversaries to be able to execute commands on the system. So once they got access to the system using these vulnerabilities, they began manipulating code on the web server. They bypassed the integrity checker, which is supposed to prevent this kind of behavior. And in one instance, they modified some client-facing JavaScript code that is used for the client to be able to authenticate with the VPN. And they modified that to not only when you send your credentials to the VPN service, also send it to this domain that's controlled by us. So they actually were able to steal credentials through this by manipulating this JavaScript code. And they also modified a script in the web server, actually a couple endpoints that allowed them to basically get reverse shell. So if they hit this endpoint, it would give them reverse shell access to the system. And then there was an implant they developed. That's called Glass Token, and Glass Token is two variants. And these were placed on various web servers within the victim's network as a way for them to be able to have persistent access to the victim's network. And one variant was placed on a bunch of internally accessible servers, so internal to the network. And then the other variant was placed on a bunch of externally accessible servers. So they were basically putting backdoors everywhere they could find. And to make matters worse, we have credible sources that with direct knowledge of various cyber adversaries that have active intrusion efforts using these same vulnerabilities. So there are other threat groups that are trying to copycat and use these vulnerabilities as well. And what this is basically my version of a visual representation of VOLTZITE's infiltration plan. Basically, they just want to get in and put backdoors wherever they can, because literally almost every step of the way, every piece of malware seemed like it was a new backdoor that they were placing somewhere within the victim's network. So noteworthy CWEs. So before we move ahead any further, First, I want to demystify some cybersecurity jargon for you. You may or may not have heard of. So, a lot of you may be familiar with CVEs, or common vulnerabilities and exposures. To keep track of, these are used to keep track of specific security flaws. And each CVE is like a detailed report of a security flaw that can be found in some software or system. Now, these CVEs are related to general types of problems we call CWEs, or common weakness enumeration. And a CWE is like this broader category that outlines the types of weaknesses that might make a system vulnerable to attack. And basically, the most simplest way to explain this is the CWE is the mistake, and the CVE is the vulnerability that's caused by the mistake. And an example would be like improper input validation, right? This is a situation where software doesn't validate what the user input into the system, right? And a vulnerability that a lot of people may know about that was very popular is Log4j, right? So I just wanted to kind of get that out the way before we dive into different CWE statistics. So I call these the king and queen of CWEs, and out of bounds read and write. I mean, it consistently ranks at the top of all weaknesses, not only this year, but year over year. These usually occur in software that's written in a way that improperly manages how data is written or retrieved from memory or from a program data structure. A classic example of this is like a buffer overflow, is something that a lot of you may have heard of. And this is caused when the underlying code doesn't properly check like the input size when writing into a data structure, buffer overflows, that is. And what can happen is the most simple form I can give you is that, let's say a structure is 10 bytes long, right? But then data is sent to it that's 100 bytes, right? Those extra 90 bytes will get written, and basically will get written to arbitrary memory, depending on where that data structure lives. And this can cause all sorts of issues, but the most common issue is just like a denial of service. The system will crash. But more advanced and skilled malware authors can get crafty and actually get these things to, execute remote code. Now, in 2023, most CVEs containing these weaknesses require zero authentication to exploit, and almost half were remotely exploitable. These vulnerabilities accounted for a whopping 16% of all the vulnerabilities analyzed by Dragos. And I don't know if Nick mentioned it earlier, but we analyzed over 2,010 vulnerabilities last year. So 16% of those were buffer overflows and are out of bounds read vulnerabilities. And this is the most surprising fact to me, is the fact that this CWE led as the most actively exploited. And the reason why that surprises me is because writing exploits for these types of vulnerabilities, it can be more difficult than other things like, let's say, command injection, which is something that we're going to talk about. And the reason why is because you have to have detailed understanding of the system in order to get anything to happen that's interesting outside of, crashing the service or device. And like I said, I'll start how I finished. The takeaway from here is that out of bounds read and write are like the king and queen of weaknesses, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So now we'll talk about one of my favorite CWEs. Just a little bit of back thought too. I didn't mention this early on, but if you check out our year in review, the actual report, you'll see we dive into a bunch of different CWEs. These were just the ones that I felt like needed to be addressed. And this one is kind of like a one that's more biased towards me, because it's like, this is one of my favorite types, and it's because it's so easy to prevent, but usually the results are very impactful. And so OS command injection is a common vulnerability, and it basically results from improper input validation. And this weakness is commonly found in web servers, on embedded devices, especially networking equipment in particular is exceptionally vulnerable to this. And this is because a lot of the times these web servers have like ping and traceroute utilities, and sometimes they don't always sanitize user input before executing the command underneath the hood. A great example of this is the image, the graphic that you see, right? A lot of the times, actually, this is one of the first vulnerabilities that I had ever found in my career was a simple command injection vulnerability. And basically what you can do is you can use an escape character, because especially if it's Linux or Unix system, you can use an escape character and put whatever you want after it. And in this case, what you see in the graphic is some reverse shell. And in 2022, we analyzed only about 23 of these CVEs containing this. However, in 2023, that number doubled to 47. This was the second most exploited weakness in the wild, and had the highest average CVSS score of 9.2. Most of the vulnerabilities containing this weakness are remotely exploitable. And another interesting statistic is that 30% of the vulns have some sort of public proof of concept. So 30% of these command injection vulnerabilities have some sort of public proof of concept. And like I said, these are my personal favorite weakness. And the reason is because it's super simple to find. They're very easy to find, very easy to exploit, usually results in privileged access, especially when coupled with like an overprivileged web server. And these two issues are very common in embedded devices, because a lot of the times the web servers execute with root level privileges. So if you find one of these, you get root level remote code execution, which basically means, hey, you win, you own the device. I'll pass it to Nick now.
All right, let's talk vulnerability management. Not every vulnerability is the same, as some have operational impacts and require immediate focus. And then some have no effect at all to the OT environment and don't really require attention at all. Because of that, we've created the now, next, never system to make things easier for vulnerability management by prioritizing what's important. First is now. Now vulnerabilities typically have been seen actively exploited, have a public POC, and cause a disruption to the OT environment. We typically recommend these to be focused right away because of the critical aspect that it has towards the OT environment and rest. Second is next. Next vulnerabilities are typically network exploitable, with some cases having operational impact. These type of vulnerabilities are often mitigated with network segmentation, port service restrictions, and such. We recommend looking into these next as if you have time requirements and resources to do so, because it doesn't require immediate action. And finally, we have never. Never vulnerabilities are typically more complicated to exploit, and some require physical access and typically don't have any impact to the OT environment, which is why we rarely require any actions. No actions are required, but we still recommend for people to look into monitoring these type of vulnerabilities for exploitation, just so you're still aware of them. Next slide, please. Here's a visual slide of the differences between now, next, never, which I'll keep on the screen for a bit longer. Kind of the most important thing about this is to remember that now we recommend looking into it right away. Next, we recommend looking into it next, and if there's time and resources. And then finally, never. No action, because of course it's likely going to be a waste of time, but still in some form of way having some form of monitoring, so you know that they still exist, even if they don't have a big impact. Next slide, please. Passing this on to Logan.
So every year we like to do like a little focus topic, and generally this is something that is unrelated to the vulnerabilities, unrelated. It's not a lot of statistics involved. It's generally something that our team either finds important, interesting, or just something I want to talk about or Nick wants to talk about. And this year, we'll be focusing on building trust with vendor products and just other vendor-related things. And this is going to be all positive stuff. We had mentioned something similar last year, and it was more talking about the pains of dealing with of doing vulnerability disclosures. But this year, we want to highlight the positives. And so at Dragos, we're dedicated to enhancing our communication and forging stronger relationships with product vendors. And many vendors naturally are hesitant to engage in like transparent, I'll say, discussions about vulnerabilities with community members who they don't basically have these long-standing relationships with. And Dragos has established former partnerships actually with some vendors and with other vendors. In other cases, like our analysts, like myself and some of our other analysts, actually maintain like individual connections with certain vendors and people in those organizations. And a key aspect of deepening these vendor relationships is building mutual trust and ensuring that Dragos is a responsible steward of the information shared with us. We recognize that certain details about vulnerabilities, like for instance, proof of concepts, this stuff can be sensitive. And therefore, like when we're reporting on vulnerabilities, we always allow vendors to review our public content before it gets published. Often word choice is critical. And I know, like for me, for instance, sometimes I overlook how my language in a report might impact a vendor's business. Like I would just, put something in a report and not think like, oh, that can hurt their business and it's not really valuable intel. So we change the language, we change the words a little bit so that, our message as to disclosing vulnerability gets across, but it doesn't go, hey, look, point the finger, bad vendor, So these are some of the things that we're working on and trying to improve. And as a trusted member of the community, Dragos is committed to like responsible communication and disclosure. We avoid any fear mongering, disparaging other companies. We understand that vulnerabilities are a crucial part of OT security, but honestly, sensationalizing them, it benefits no one. While others may, panic about some new publicly exploited vulnerability, we as Dragos, we want to remain calm and like be that like voice of reasoning in those moments. It's important to us to not waste asset owners' time by always constantly ringing alarms when the next thing comes out, so that if the case does come where we do need to kind of shake the walls, scream to the top of our lungs, people listen. But yeah, it's no point of sensationalizing things and making things bigger than they need to be. So we like to remain calm in those situations and kind of be the voice of reason. So let's talk about vendor wins this year. These are a couple of vendors that shined, honestly, this year. I want to give special thanks to all three of these vendors, and I'll go into a little detail about each one. Rockwell Automation, I mean, I kind of spoke about that earlier, so it's no point of diving in, but I just want to say thank you. Awesome job on that disclosure last year. You guys did awesome bringing all the community members together, something that was never done. Once again, shout out Maggie at Rockwell Automation. I also want to thank Douglas Brown and Mike Chin from Omron North America. I had the opportunity personally to engage with these two multiple times last year, addressing different vulnerabilities and incidents that occurred. And Doug actually acted as like a liaison basically between Dragos and Omron Japan. And it was super interesting because they were super cool about me speaking about these vulnerabilities that I found at S4, the S4 conference. And like they never asked for like unfair changes. All of the things that they had concerns about, when I look back at it, I'm like, okay, yeah, I get that. I shouldn't say that way, or I shouldn't put that information out. That may help the adversaries. And so even another point is that when I actually disclosed those vulnerabilities to Doug and let him know to let Amron know, I was within days. I was on a call with Omron Japan and with their security engineers and their software engineers in Japan, and they were very interested and wanted to figure out how to solve the problems and figure out what I found. And they're kind of having a culture shift there where they're actually historically Omron like never was the one to update firmware. And now like their whole culture and security culture is changing and getting much better. And so kudos to them for that. And then the next company I want to talk about is Phoenix Contact. They shined this year after responding to some runtime vulnerabilities in a very exceptional manner. So our analyst, Reed Whiteman, who we call internally our Vuln boss, that guy like looks at a PLC and then like vulnerabilities just dump out of it. But anyways, he found issues in their PLC next runtime. And instead of Phoenix Contact, which happens sometimes, instead of them getting defensive or, kind of weird about it, they actually sent Reed a newer version of the PLC to test his findings against. And so basically Reed shared that he had found these issues in their runtime. And they were like, oh, that's interesting. Here, let me send you this newer device or this different device. and tell me if it works on this as well. So this is like next level collaboration, and they should be applauded for that. So all of you guys are awesome, and there are other vendors that I'm sure have exceptional security programs and P-Cert teams, but these three in particular were ones that my team interfaced with directly, and we had great success stories from. So if you're a vendor or really anyone interested in establishing a line of communication with our vulnerability research team, please don't hesitate to reach out to one of our analysts. Like, we are eager to forge new relationships with product vendors. You can email intel@Dragos if you want, or if you're not getting a response there, or you want to contact me directly, feel free to stalk me on LinkedIn or email me at lcarpenter @dragos.com. And we are always super eager to work with vendors. We want to work with all vendors. We want to create an ecosystem where all of these trusted security vendors, even our competitors, like, we need to have this ecosystem of transparency and be able to have this kind of even trust to where we can get insights on these vulnerabilities and be trusted enough that we won't disclose things that are harmful or will help the adversaries, but we'll be able to create better detections for our customers and for the public. So, future outlook. So this section is mainly geared towards, what to expect this year from our vulnerability team. So our vulnerability team is planning to release a series of expert deep dives on various vulnerability topics. I have a research project that's going on right now that I think would be a great candidate for this. A few of our analysts have been actually looking at more IoT devices and IIoT devices. So I think right now we have like a webcam advisory and some building automation stuff coming down the pipe. But our team has been deep diving into those and looking more at those types of devices for vulnerabilities. So we're trying to expand our advisory coverage of IoT and IIoT vulnerabilities as well. And a little under a year ago, I started working tirelessly on getting Windows and Cisco vulnerability coverage into platform. And we are finally at the last mile of this. So if you are a platform customer, you can expect by the end of the year that we'll have that Windows and Cisco vulnerability coverage, or what we call IT and OT coverage in platform. And just kind of a personal promotion. My S4 presentation will be public on the S4 Events YouTube channel later this year. I think maybe around the August timeframe, they plan to release that. So that's centered around some Omron vulnerabilities that I found last year, and I kind of detail out this attack that adversaries could potentially use to attack Omron servos in the future. So that's some of the things that you can expect from our team in the coming years, and I think now we'll turn it over for Q&A. I'm not sure if Nick has some questions here he wants to answer. You all can put questions in the Q&A chat, and we'll kind of go through and answer what we can.
Thanks, Logan and Nick. So feel free to pop your questions in. We have some questions coming in already. So the first one, has there been better partnership with industrial automation vendors and asset owners? An asset owner came forward at a cybersecurity conference where they had provided a lot of technical information with very little information returned, and it said it was presented at the same conference. I think, Logan, if you can answer that one.
And I kind of spoke to that earlier, right? Dragos ourselves, we're, trying to strategically partner with different automation vendors. As far as like the asset owners themselves partnering with vendors, I'm not sure if that's happening, but I know the industry and the security vendors are trying our best to nurture those partnerships so we can provide our customers and the public really with the best security possible.
Okay, so when Logan says the PLCs were connected to the internet, I think we're referring to the Unitronics vulnerabilities here. Does that mean there was no firewall between the PLCs and the internet?
I guess the correct answer for this would be, I guess technically you would assume that the answer is no, there's no firewall, or there's just a poor firewall. But basically, when I say it's connected to the internet, is that I can go on Shodan and find it, basically, right? And Shodan is a service that, you can kind of search and see what kind of devices are connected to the internet. And so that's what I mean. The PLC was connected to the internet, meaning I can ping it from my, house.
Okay, here's a good question for you, Nick. So some companies are struggling with prioritizing patching and risk assessing huge backlogs of vulnerabilities. Whether they try to patch everything or risk assess everything, they hardly have the time and resources to make significant process. So what would your team see as better techniques or strategies for patch management?
Yeah, great question. So this actually goes back to the slide, now, next, never. It's the system that we've created based on our manual analysis, and it's based on what type of impact it can have to the OT environment. To know what to prioritize is also based on, does it have active exploitation? Does it have POCs? Is it something that can cause OT environment impact? If this vulnerability has all these factors checked, this is obviously going to be something you're going to prioritize over a vulnerability, let's say a simulation software within an OT environment that has absolutely no OT impact and requires local access and credentials. And it's mainly within the system we created, which the platform does provide, is the now next system, that we get to kind of manually go over and analyze these vulnerabilities and see, do these have these factors? Are they going to impact the environment? Are they really easy to exploit? And are they affecting levels at the Purdue level, which are for the crown jewels of your OT environment? So it could be a bit more complicated to identify these vulnerabilities if you're using your own source or your own kind of form factor. But when you have a system like the now, next, never, where you have us analyze these type of vulnerabilities and manually choose, and not choose, but also understand the type of impacts it has and how you can exploit them, that's kind of how you're going to be able to prioritize. If you do remember on the now section for this webinar, I did mention that 3% of the vulnerabilities out of the 2010 are to be addressed now. So although there was over 2,000 vulnerabilities, only 3% are the ones that we highly recommend based on these factors.
Thanks, Nick. So next question, does Dragos create the asset map?
I guess I can take that question. Do you want to take it, Nick?
Asset map. The asset map?
Yeah. So basically, currently, what we do is whenever we analyze a particular advisory, we will go and we'll find all of the impacted products. And we actually have somebody that's on our team named Casey full time, and her job is literally to make sure that we are mapping mapping assets or products in a correct way, so that way everything leads back to platform. And we are getting better at it and trying to improve it each and every day. And that's part of what Casey's actual full-time job is. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, so what do you think differentiates you from other vulnerability finding vendors? And I think that should be an easy question.
Yeah, and it's back to the Dragos sauce. If you actually pay attention to a lot of them, it's more of a just copy paste whatever's already posted on NIST, or it's just the same wording itself. While we actually go and take the initiative to find the protocols and services and anything that isn't already included to help prioritize your vulnerability. Most of these are just saying, hey, patch to the next version, or if there isn't a solution, that's it. But we go and say, hey, these protocols, these services, these entry points, and these things can be addressed that weren't mentioned originally. But we went ahead and used our own analysis and own insights by either downloading the software, going into documentations, and just past experience to know what we can do to improvise and make these analysis better. And not only that, but already understand the impacts as well. As I answered in the past question, knowing, do these type of vulnerabilities have a form of impact? Because a vulnerability itself could have a high CVSS score and another low one, but the low one can actually have some form of impact to the OT environment. Because if a lot of people don't know, the CVSS score wasn't really primarily made for an OT environment, which is why we have to kind of take those extra steps of analysis and understanding to know how and prioritize or just assess a vulnerability within an OT environment.
Nick, here's one for Logan. Have you looked at the percentage of out-of-bound read vulnerabilities if you take out the ones found during the pwn-to-own ICS contest, and did it differ much?
The answer to that question is I have not done that deep of an analysis on that particular CWE. However, I would assume, based on what I do know, is that it wouldn't make too big of a difference because, like I mentioned, although there are a lot of out of bound read vulnerabilities, I also mentioned that they are also some of the most publicly exploited out in the wild. So unless those, if those pwn to own vulnerabilities are being used by threat groups, that is a whole different conversation we need to have, and that will require more research on my part. However, assuming that's not the case, I don't think it would make too big of a difference because even if we take out a chunk of it, the large majority of these vulnerabilities being exploited out in the wild are these out of bounds read and write vulnerabilities.
Logan, okay, so next question. I noted in the annual report that 19% of all vulnerabilities from CISA had no patch and no mitigation. What should critical infrastructure operations staff do with those advisories?
I mean, I could take that one, but unless Nick wants to.
I could definitely take that one. With a situation like that, we typically would recommend, obviously, the first thing is look into our own analysis, because for the most part, within these percentages, we come along and add the protocols and services to add. And in some occasions, you're not even able to patch. I mean, when it comes to a situation like this, I think if you don't have resources like us to help you in any chance as a customer, then the best occasion is what we do is kind of take the time. If you do have the time and resources, is to kind of understand the vulnerability by looking at multiple sources and whatnot. But that could be very time consuming if you have a lot of things to do, which is what we do to help analyze and save you time, so you no longer have to go through multiple sources and research and all that. You have us as a disposal to give you those alternatives to no patch or a patch only.
Okay. There was one question that I actually want to answer, which came in from a few different people. If you do want to sign up for a demo, you can email sales@dragos.com, or you can reach out to us. We have a request demo form as well as contact us form on our website. Here's another question. What is the average time for vendors to address any one CVE, and did it get any better in 2023?
The short answer is I don't know for that second part as far as it getting any better. We didn't really do any statistical analysis on it. Maybe that's something we can try to figure out. It'd be hard to actually figure out on a large scale, because we would have to know, like when the CVE, maybe we could look at like when the CVE was reserved versus when it was publicly disclosed or something like that. But to the first part of it, the average time it takes, it honestly varies. Some depending on the vulnerability and the severity. Some I think Maggie had mentioned in her talk at X4 that they had the intel about the issues, the vulnerabilities, for like 6 months before they brought us in. So before they brought the vendors in, they had already had that intel for 6 months. They had already started, developing patches and all of that. And then I think it took us like another couple weeks to get the advisories and everything out the door. So in that situation, that was a critical one, and it took like 6 months to get out the door. And for other ones, we've had team members. I mean, Sam, I think he had a particular vendor he was dealing with, and it took like almost a year and a half for him to get his disclosure from start to finish. And then, Reed has had similar situations where he's had, a year and a half until he can get something out the window. But now, our policy, we give vendors 90 days to get their stuff together for a response before we disclose. And that's part of our disclosure policy. And now, since before we couldn't really enforce it as much, and because we could, would just try to play nice with the vendors. And that's why it would end up being a year and a half until the vulnerabilities got released. But now Dragos is actually a CNA. So we can kind of force the vendor's hand and go, hey, look, like we've contacted CISA, they know, we know. If you don't want to move forward or work with us and cooperate with us to get this forward, we can just reserve the CVEs ourselves and disclose them that way. And generally, in most cases, they will comply and try to work best with us. Most of the big name vendors, they have great processes in place to where they have kind of these patch cycles that they do. So they are a little more efficient, but we've had, I mean, issues where we've been just, hey, look at this vulnerability that we found in this device is being publicly exploited, and literally get crickets, right? And so it varies, right? Some vendors are better than others, and then other vendors, kind of give us the cold shoulder from time to time. And that's part of this process of trying to build trust, build open communication, and even educating vendors for real, to some degree, because some of these device vendors, they don't have a ton of experience having to deal with these patch cycles. Like I had mentioned, I had conversations with Amran where, they basically were like, like historically we never were the type, but we never had to really worry about patching it because, all of our systems work together and we never really had to worry about releasing patches. But now we want to be more security centric. So, we're developing those processes internally.
Thanks, Logan. Okay, so I think that might be all of the questions that we can answer at this time. If we didn't have an opportunity to answer your question, just understand that it might be because it's a little bit challenging to answer live. Still do reach out to us if you still need answers to the questions that you're asking. And like I said, you can reach out to us at sales@dragos.com or intel@dragos.com. And yes, the brewery still does exist. So I want to thank you everyone for your time today, and great thanks to our presenters. You make vulnerability analysis a lot of fun. So we hope the information that we've shared today was helpful to you. I'd like to invite everyone to download the OT Cybersecurity Year in Review Report if you haven't done so already. And please tune in for the third webinar in our series. It's our Year in Review Lessons Learned webinar, and it's another must watch. So that'll be with our professional services team. And if you need urgent assistance or have additional questions on Dragos solutions, please reach out using the contact form on our website. And thank you to everyone for all that you do to protect the world's critical infrastructure.